Who are our greatest presidents? What lessons can the modern-day business leader learn from our 46 chiefs of state? Find out in this podcast series with Tom Fox and Richard Lummis to delve into the great and not-so-great presidents to mine their successes and failures for today's business executive.
And this is our fourth and final episode of looking at leadership lessons from George Washington, we consider his presidential years.
During the first year of his presidency, the cabinet, which is a group not explicitly in the Constitution, consisted of the Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of War, Henry Knox, and Attorney General Edmund Randolph. Not a group of shrinking violets, people with forceful personalities and actually very different philosophies of what the government should be. Tom, what do you think about how Washington was able to handle some of the conflicts that he faced within his own cabinet?
So if we can steal Doris Kearns Godwin's phrase, a team of rivals, this was certainly a team of rivals. And the Jefferson-Hamilton feud, I think at the end of the day, led to tragic consequences down the road, not involving Jefferson, but certainly involving Hamilton. They had very different philosophies on a national government style, and I think they manifested themselves around a national bank. Hamilton believed in a strong federal government, national government, requiring a national bank and foreign loans to function, whereas Jefferson believed government should be primarily directed by the states with yeoman farmers, I guess living in Valhalla, wanting to yoked oxen. But nevertheless, he did not believe in that more of a federalist system. Perhaps Washington, the way Washington handled this was he did ask, or at least try to get them to bury their hatchet. They never did. And it got worse and worse. And Jefferson eventually resigned from the cabinet, I believe early on in Washington's second term. So the management of that was, from Washington's perspective, was to not manage. That's actually a leadership style too. And originally I thought that portended a really poor leadership style, but the more I thought about it, the more I researched it, he was able to stand above it, not intercede directly, although he did once again ask them to bury the hatchet and reconcile. But they both brought great strengths to the cabinet, and he was able to have a cabinet, although only 4 men originally, to advise him. And he had some of the most talented people in the United States. And Hamilton's National Bank was really a leading financial institution in the world at that point in time. Jefferson's foreign policy, I think, probably tended to go a little bit more towards the pro-revolutionary France than Washington was comfortable with, yet he allowed Jefferson to really pursue that policy as well. So it seemed to me a situation where he brought in incredibly top talent. He allowed them to manage the way they saw fit. He did, at the end of the day, support Hamilton and the bank. I think having a central bank's a good thing. So in my mind, that's something that was positive. It was certainly cutting-edge economic theory and policy in the 1790s. So I thought that was something positive as well.
And here I always thought you were a Jacksonian populist. One of the things that I think he did miss a trick on was he basically didn't talk to John Adams, his vice president. The role of vice president has changed over the years. The initial phase, it was simply the runner-up for president, which I guess since Washington was unanimous, I'm not sure how they picked Adams, but maybe it was just a separate ballot. I'd have to look that up. But he never attended a single cabinet meeting. And I think Adams could be prickly, but I think his advice might have been helpful.
You can drop the Adams might be or Adams could be, but you're absolutely right. John Adams was one of the great thinkers of the Founding Fathers, perhaps more comfortable as a theorist, yet he had been governor of Massachusetts, so he had actual experience running a government. the biography of Adams that David McCullough wrote was just, I thought, stunning. And, that's a different subject for a different podcast. So it was perhaps an opportunity lost as well.
I guess some of the other things that happened during his terms, I guess one of the most famous was the Whiskey Rebellion, which he handled with consummate skill. The more you look into it, the more it appears to have been just this total comedy of errors. The setting was the federal government needed money, in part because of Alexander Hamilton's proposal that the government take over the state's debt as well as its own, or the Confederation's debt. And one of the ways he proposed to do that was an excise tax on whiskey. At the time, the farmers in Pennsylvania and the Ohio River Valley had no way to get corn to market because of poor roads. And so they tended to turn it into whiskey. And the government was going to charge them 9 cents a gallon in taxes, and they would only accept cash as payment, which in the rural parts of the country, cash was kind of sparse. The farmers tended to refuse to pay. There were several instances where they would tar and feather the tax collectors. There were several attacks on tax collectors. They burned down houses and so forth. And then they eventually threatened to attack Pittsburgh. Washington, I think, first of all, recognized their grievances were not unfounded. But at the same time, he could not allow the federal government to appear weak or irresolute. And the first time, he sent some emissaries to try and talk the rebels down, and that didn't work. So instead, he proceeded with the second best option, which was absolutely overwhelming force. He got a ruling from the Supreme Court that a military response was justified under the auspices of the Militia Acts. He assumed emergency power and assembled an army of 12,000 men. The rebels at this point kind of understood that this was not such a great idea, and they basically disappeared. Militia Army rounded up several suspected rebels, took them to Philadelphia to stand trial. 2 were convicted of treason, and Washington pardoned them both. This is a fascinating episode, in part because it reaffirmed the authority of the federal government in an almost indirect way. But I think Washington's handling of it was absolutely masterful.
I agree, Richard, and there's a couple of other points that I would like to raise around leadership and his leadership in this. This is one example of leading by example. Washington initially, for admittedly a short time, took command of the Army. So you had the President of the United States, the Commander-in-Chief, actually leading an army for the first time and only time in U.S. history, and the last time.
No, the last time.
But then he gave his command to Harry Lee. We've talked about Harry Lee in a prior podcast, and Harry Lee had been removed from command during the Revolutionary War after the Battle of Monmouth in New Jersey. And so Lee had a somewhat distinguished political career between the Revolutionary War and Washington becoming president. He had actually been a president of the United States during the Articles of Confederation. So, but Washington, while not trusting him when he relieved him during the Revolutionary War, did trust him enough after this incident to give command to Harry Lee. So those, to me, demonstrated a couple of leadership skills. One was that leading from the front and taking charge, and we've seen Washington do that a couple of times throughout this podcast series, but also bringing Harry Lee back in as a very trusted advisor, and trusting him so much that he gave command to him to put down the Whiskey Rebellion. Your couple of your points at the way he handled it in terms of preparing the country for it, laying a foundation, not just jumping up, calling up the militia and leading them out, laying down a legal foundation, and also at the end when he pardoned those who were convicted and subject to execution, I thought showed great leadership as well.
A minor footnote was that the excise tax was tax was not repealed until Thomas Jefferson was president, and it was probably a slap at Hamilton, since it was Hamilton's policy that had enacted it. One of the great things about Washington and his role as general, when he explicitly and constantly acknowledged his subordination to Congress, was his view of the Constitution as delineating proper spheres of action. And it's probably beyond the scope to talk about the Judiciary Act, but it's also, he repeatedly emphasized that the role of the executive was the conduct of foreign affairs. And I know there are a couple of instances that you'd like to talk about, Tom, that occurred during his first term, I think.
Actually, I think they were during his second term, but it really is not relevant.
Well, they were.
He really set U.S. foreign policy for 100 years. And that was a policy of neutrality that obviously changed with Teddy Roosevelt and First World War and going forward into the 20th century. Nevertheless, he passed the Neutrality Act. There was a great, event during this time around someone called Citizen Genet. And Citizen Genet was the representative of the French revolutionary government, who was the French minister to the United States. Unfortunately for Citizen Genet, he tried to set up a series of revolutionary clubs and councils in the United States to generate propaganda for the French revolutionary government. And Washington viewed this as antithetical to being a true neutral and had him recalled over this affair. The flip side, though, is the John Jay Treaty. And people call it the John Jay Treaty. It was a treaty that set our relationship with the United Kingdom for many years forward, and at least until the War of 1812. Jay is generally vilified for signing this treaty, but it was Washington who approved it. And the Senate approved it. Washington approved it as well. And Washington realized the need that they had to have a treaty in place with Britain. Britain was the greatest power in the world at this time, and he swallowed what he thought were some less than favorable positions to get a treaty done. And I think that's the mark of a great politician, when he gets the best deal he can. It may not be the most optimum, but he was able to conclude a treaty with Britain through his negotiator, John Jay.
Well, one thing about the treaty, I think it was actually not a bad deal, given the weak position of America vis-a-vis Great Britain. In some respects, it reminded me of the Britain cession of Hong Kong to China. When the option is the continuation of war, or the start of a war in that case, it really makes accepting a few minor quibbles seem a lot more palatable, especially if you've been a general through a protracted war. Citizen Genet was interesting. It resulted in basically an undeclared naval war with the U.S., in part because Citizen Genet, by the time he was recalled, the Jacobins had assumed control in Paris, and Citizen Genet probably correctly assumed that he had a date with the guillotine if he actually went home. So he asked for asylum and was granted it, despite his prior activities. We've seen this over and over with Washington, the ability to be magnanimous in victory. Certainly recurs as a theme. I guess the other thing about his role in foreign affairs, and not just foreign affairs, but the proper scope of government, has to be his farewell address. What are your thoughts on that one, Tom?
Richard, this document, this speech, I think is still taught today. He didn't lash out, but he warned against regionalism, partisanship, and foreign entanglements. I think those are probably still pretty good words today. In a land war in Asia might be a direct antecedent. At least you may never want to get in a five-sided battle that's been going on for 2,000 years in the Middle East. It was, I thought, a great end to his term, he showed clarity of purpose with his speech, which is also a trait of leadership. We talked about his leading by example and from the front in terms of the Whiskey Rebellion. The third point I'd like to raise is he focused on the work, not the prize. He answered the call to be the first president of the United States. Many believe the office was designed specifically for him. He, the person that went to offer him the position after he was elected from the representative from the Congress, was still not sure he would take it. And indeed, there were some poignant words from Martha Custis after he left when she wondered if she would ever see her husband again because of the vicissitudes of travel and his age at that time. So the farewell address to me seemed to just be put the exclamation mark on both terms as a leader. I guess he did ride off into the sunset, but he left us with a legacy that we can still study today, still learn from today, and still be inspired from today.
That's the most famous part of it, the part on foreign affairs, because it's been so prescient. But he also talked about the dangers of political parties and what they used to call faction. And I think that has also turned out to be remarkably prescient if ignored. And, of course, his opinion on foreign affairs has been ignored for the last century and a quarter or so. I don't know how you feel about this, but I think if there is a problem with Washington, he felt so strongly in virtue and self-control, and he practiced them so diligently that I think he may have expected other people to do the same to an extent that's unrealistic. I think he felt that it was necessary if you were going to maintain a Republican form of government. I think the jury's still out on that one. I think it's interesting that he made that case over and over again.
Maybe if I could take that and twist it a quarter turn, Richard, because you're absolutely right. I think he did expect in many ways others to a standard that he held himself to, even if it was more difficult for them to do so, but he also treated others with utmost respect. Most notably, I would suppose, during his military career when he treated the lowest private with dignity, but he afforded respect of visiting dignitaries from the Continental Congress when they came to see him. He respected individuals who came to the White House, as was their right and their actions at that time, to actually petition to the government. He treated service personnel, subordinates, people with that level of respect, even if he did hold many of the senior leaders to a higher standard. And that's something I think can also be the mark of a great leader as well.
Well, I think that's a fair correction. But certainly I think as a leader, the holding yourself to a high standard is a good practice. Acquiring it in others, certainly in a military context, is probably very important, especially with respect to, say, courage. And all in all, he's just a remarkable man. There are a couple more biographies of him that I still have to read, and I guess I need to put them on top of my stack again.
Well, Richard, I found this just to be a fascinating series. As with most of the work we've done together or podcasts we've done together, the research has been a large part of the fun, but being able to discuss this with you and really highlight some of the things that we've seen that perhaps we wish were in play today has been equally enjoyable.
I agree. And this one has, as usual, been full of some surprises, most of them pleasant, but all of them interesting. For now, this is Richard Lummis and Tom Fox signing off for 12 O'Clock High. We hope you'll listen in next time.
This is Tom Fox. I hope you have enjoyed this special 4-part podcast series Richard and I did on George Washington as much as we enjoyed researching it and bringing it to you. I hope that you will rate our podcast on iTunes if you've listened to it on that format. 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership, is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network and a proud member of C-Suite Radio. I hope you will join us again next week for another episode. This is Tom Fox again. I hope you've enjoyed this 4-part podcast series on leadership lessons from George Washington. I hope you will join us again for our next episode where we take a look at John Adams and then, of course, Thomas Jefferson. If you have not done so and you've enjoyed this podcast, I would greatly appreciate if you would leave us a review on iTunes. It would help in our ratings and help get the word out about this most unusual podcast, which pairs historical figures in the forms of U.S. presidents and leadership lessons for today's business executives. This podcast series is a special production of the Compliance Podcast Network.